Question period. I recognize a member from Saskatoon Eastview.
Here.
Mr. Speaker, Saskatchewan people are struggling with the cost of living, but you wouldn't know it from listening to this tired and out-of-touch government. According to them, everything is just fine. But out there, 57% of people are struggling to pay for groceries. And we lead the nation in mortgage arrears. And 6,000 jobs were lost last month. With facts like these, it's no wonder that they ditched their slogan, growth that works for everyone. Families need a break when it comes to the cost of living. Why won't the Premier act and cut the fuel tax today?
Hear, hear.
Recognize the Minister of Finance.
When looking at all factors of taxation and cost within government, you have to look at more than just one, and we lead the nation in affordability. I will just do some comparisons, and I know the members opposite have heard them before, but in Saskatchewan, we can earn $20,000 more that are tax-free than Manitoba that cut the fuel tax. The fuel tax saves them $410, but I would imagine it's a lot more than that of income tax on $20,000. Let's talk about PST. Saskatchewan's PST 6%, Manitoba 7%. Ontario, that I know the members opposite have used as an example, is 8%. How about PST on utilities, Mr. Speaker? The PST, Manitoba has PST on utilities, so does Ontario. Saskatchewan does not. That's savings for Saskatchewan people. If you talk about PST on fuel over top of the excise tax that they want us to cut, Ontario has PST on fuel. Saskatchewan does not. Let's talk about a health premium. Ontario has a health.
Recognize a member from Saskatoon Eastview.
I guess the finance minister wants to let the people out there know that they've got it wrong when they're struggling to pay the bills.
Right.
Mr. Speaker, this tired and out-of-touch government is failing on the cost of living, and they're failing to ensure that First Nations and Métis people are heard in this province too. Nowhere is that more clear than with the duty to consult. Last year, the Sask Party government rolled out new duty to consult framework, but they failed to get the consultations right. Mr. Speaker, this failure didn't just impact Indigenous folks, it impacts all of us. We all lose out when First Nations and Métis people don't have their voices heard. How did the Sask Party fail so badly at consulting Indigenous people on the duty to consult?
Hear, hear.
Recognize the Minister of Government Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, he's partially true. Certainly, we did engage First Nations and Métis people on the duty to consult. It had been a policy that had been in place for 10 years, and we thought it was time to review it. So invitations were sent to all First Nations, Mr. Speaker, Métis locals, tribal councils, as well as other Indigenous organizations. Not only did we consult on the First Nations file and the Indigenous file, but we also consulted with municipal associations, both SUMA and SARM. We consulted with industry, whether it was CAP or Saskatchewan Mining Association, and we got a lot of feedback, Mr. Speaker. Not all engaged, and that's perfectly fine if they chose to. We extended the timeline twice for those groups that wanted to engage but felt the timeline was too short, Mr. Speaker. We've engaged with a number of them, had feedback, adjusted the policy, enacted it on January 1st, Mr. Speaker. We've trained over 300 government employees on the new policy and look forward to the work that it...
Recognize a member from Saskatoon East Centre.
Miigwech, Mr. Speaker. The updated duty to consult policy does not uphold inherent and treaty rights, especially the right to practice those rights. Even more alarming, consultation for updating the so-called new policy was not done adequately. Only 31% of First Nation and 38% of Métis locals were engaged. These are failing grades by any measure. Is this government satisfied with the number? And how does this government hold itself accountable and ensure that it is not breaching its constitutional obligation?
Hear, hear.
Recognize the Minister of Government Relations.
Mr. Speaker, this government is committed to is committed to fulfilling the government's legal duty to consult, which is in the Constitution, Mr. Speaker. How that is conducted is through the duty to consult policy framework, which we reviewed over the past year and a half and implemented on January 1st, Mr. Speaker. And I have already identified the number of groups that we've consulted with. If groups wanted to engage with us, they certainly could. We made phone calls. We went on reserve, if that was the case, Mr. Speaker. We engaged with all, including industry, Mr. Speaker. Now, I know the member opposite may want to talk about legislation put forward. Who did she consult with that legislation, Mr. Speaker? Did she consult with the Saskatchewan Mining Association? Did she consult with the Saskatchewan Association of Petroleum Producers? Did she consult with the Saskatchewan Urban Municipalities Association or the Saskatchewan Association of Rural Municipalities? I'd love to hear her answer.
Recognize a member from Saskatoon Centre. I hear you.
Inherent and treaty rights holders have consistently raised cumulative impacts prior to the new revised policy framework. The fact of the matter is, this government has consistently ignored questions on how they are going to address cumulative impacts on traditional territories, even though they say they will revise their policies to stay up to date with current case law. How is this government working with inherent and treaty rights holders to identify an appropriate baseline for assessing cumulative effects based on their unique history, values, and interests?
Recognize the Minister of Government Relations.
Mr. Speaker, the policy framework had been in place for 10 years, revised as of this past year and a half, with the new policy framework going into effect on January 1st. I think there have been changes made to make the policy more reactive for business and industry, certainly, but has extended the time for communities to engage in consultation with the stakeholders that they need to. That is what was asked for by communities, Mr. Speaker, and that's what the new framework policy has in place. Mr. Speaker, but let's look at the amount of industry and development that this province, that all citizens of this province benefit from. That has gone through duty to consult, Mr. Speaker, whether it's been the mining industry in the north or the forest industry, Mr. Speaker, that helps all people in the north get jobs and pursue their lives that they want, Mr. Speaker. I think the policy framework has served this province fairly well, and I think the new policy framework will even be better.
Recognize a member from Saskatoon Centre.
Mr. Speaker, Indigenous people in Saskatchewan, the inherent and treaty rights holders, continue to demand action on meaningful duty to consult. Let me spell that out. Meaningful duty to consult is a two-way dialogue during the consultation process. Indigenous people have not had any meaningful two-way dialogue when it comes to duty to consult with this tired and out-of-touch government. When will this government stop giving lip service to reconciliation and how much they respect inherent and treaty rights holders and have a real two-way dialogue on the duty to consult process?
Recognize the Minister of Government Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would certainly say that the government's track record is not giving lip service to reconciliation. Absolutely not, Mr. Speaker. And, Mr. Speaker, that's why we reviewed the policy, to get input from all stakeholders, Mr. Speaker, Indigenous communities as well as industry. The member opposite has failed to answer the question, and I don't know, I think I know what the answer is, and that's why she's not answering. She has consulted with one or two organizations, failed to answer any consultation issues with the Saskatchewan Mining Association, the Saskatchewan Association of Petroleum Producers. I know she didn't consult with SARM. Did she consult with SUMA, Mr. Speaker? She's standing there lecturing this government on what we should do to consult, and she has hardly consulted with anybody on her own policy, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member from Saskatoon Centre.
This government continues to say different things in different rooms. They say in face-to-face meetings with inherent and treaty rights holders that they will accommodate the local requests. Then as soon as they leave that community, they do the exact opposite. First Nation and Métis people are fed up with being ignored by this tired and out-of-touch government. When will this government stop treating inherent and treaty rights holders who raise valid concerns with utter disrespect and disregard?
Hear, hear.
Recognize the Minister of Government Relations.
Hear, hear. Mr. Speaker, I think we should kind of maybe even cut to the chase a little bit further as to what this really means for the member opposite. It really means resource revenue sharing is what that member is offering, Mr. Speaker, and is certainly in favour of. She has stood with First Nations that want to go towards resource revenue sharing. Now, talk about saying one thing in one room and something else in another. Their leaders have been on both sides of that issue. I believe Dwayne Lingenfelter campaigned on resource revenue sharing. This member opposite is in favour of resource revenue sharing. Where is the member and the leader of the opposition and that party when it comes to resource revenue sharing? Because we believe that all people share in the resources this province has.
Recognize the member from Saskatoon Centre.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we do know for a matter of fact that policy has no teeth. Legislation does. Mr. Speaker, this province has fallen behind other jurisdictions on duty to consult. Others, like BC, have enacted legislation to implement UNDRIP. The government's new consultation policy doesn't even address this important declaration, nor does it refer to the principles contained within it. How does the minister intend to work with Indigenous people without referencing any of the principles within UNDRIP?
Hear, hear.
Recognize the Minister of Government Relations.
Mr. Speaker, I find it very interesting that the member opposite is talking about legislation around consultation, lecturing us on who we should consult with, Mr. Speaker, and how we should consult. We have engaged with as many First Nations as would engage with us, Mr. Speaker, a number of Métis locals, a number of tribal councils. But she's talking about engagement and she's talking about consultation, and she's failed to consult with industry, Mr. Speaker, whether it's the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, whether it was the Saskatchewan Mining Association, whether it's SUMA, who is somewhere in the gallery today, or SARM, Mr. Speaker. Isn't that part of a consultation process? If you're going to put forward legislation, I sure think it should be.
Recognize a member from the John Elphinstone Centre.
What a disappointing answer in the presence of many inherent and treaty rights holders, Mr. Speaker. When the government fails to get these important constitutional issues right, we all end up paying for it. We see that with the duty to consult, and we see that with the ongoing litigation on the government's pronoun policy. But when it comes to the public dollars that are flowing out to a private law firm on that case, the Sask Party is refusing to disclose the amount. Our justice critic asked about that number at committee on Tuesday, and the Minister for Justice refused to answer. So I'll ask again, how much public money is being spent on private lawyers fighting this pronoun case in the courts?
Recognize the Minister of Justice and Attorney General.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's our position that parental rights are worth defending. Is it theirs? That they've gone pretty quiet on that issue, Mr. Speaker. The only time that side ever feigns concern for taxpayers is on this, which of course we share. Mr. Speaker, information on all legal fees paid to private firms is provided every single year through private accounts, Mr. Speaker. The Ministry of Justice regularly retains private counsel, a practice that certainly predates this government, on files that require additional capacity or specialization. Mr. Speaker, in this case, the Ministry of Justice and a private law firm are representing the Ministry of Education, and they are representing them in a case that was brought against the government. We are defendants in active legislation, Mr. Speaker. Solicitor-client privilege goes to the heart of any legal case and ensures that strategical and tactical choices to defend that case remain confidential. The retainer is a part of that, and subject to that privilege, I don't intend to violate that, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member from the John Elphinstone Centre.
Right, Mr. Speaker. Saskatchewan people deserve basic answers and accountability for public dollars being spent. When the Sask Party hired private lawyers to fight the carbon tax case, it cost taxpayers $500,000. And the Justice Minister at the time to his credit, was crystal clear about what costs were being downloaded to taxpayers. But things have sure changed with this Sask party, Mr. Speaker. That minister is on his way out, and the new Minister of Justice won't disclose these basic costs, hiding behind solicitor-client privilege. Why won't the minister stop with the games and release the basic information to Saskatchewan people?
Recognize the Minister of Justice and Attorney General.
There are important distinctions here, very important distinction in the sense that in that case we brought forward the reference. Mr. Speaker, we brought forward the reference. In this case, we are defendants in active litigation in a case that was brought against us. And, Mr. Speaker, we will use all tools necessary to protect parental rights, including an appeal all the way to the Supreme Court if necessary, and we have been very clear about that, Mr. Speaker. But retainers with private firms, which is a practice they did, we did, Mr. Speaker, that remains part of confidential client solicitor privilege, Mr. Speaker. While the case is ongoing, it is an important fundamental right, Mr. Speaker, and once that case is resolved, then all of that information will, of course, come out, Mr. Speaker, as it does every year in public accounts, every single year to private firms, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member from Regina Elphinstone Centre.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it sure is rich to get a lecture in solicitor-client privilege from an Attorney General who's never practiced law. Mr. Speaker, this is a pattern from the least transparent and accountable government in Saskatchewan history. They think they don't have to answer to anyone, that the rules don't apply to them. They run roughshod over the rights of Indigenous people and vulnerable kids. And when those matters end up in court, they think it's okay to withhold the costs from taxpayers. How can the minister justify withholding this information? How much has been paid out to this private law firm so far?
Recognize the Minister of Justice and Attorney General.
Information regarding all legal fees paid to private firms is provided through public accounts every year. And, Mr. Speaker, for a member who never fails to remind us about her broad and deep legal expertise, if anyone should recognize the importance of solicitor-client privilege, Mr. Speaker, and how that matters in terms of a case such as this, where we are active defendants in this case, Mr. Speaker, she should. And, Mr. Speaker, this is a case which we will fight all the way. This is a case which is of importance to this government, which matters to us. Parental rights matter in this province. It matters across the country. They know it, and that's why they've gone silent on this issue, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member from Regina Elphinstone Centre.
Well, I thank the minister for the compliment, but it doesn't change the fact that this tired and out-of-touch government hates transparency. They won't reveal the cost of defending their unconstitutional pronoun policy in the courts, something her predecessor had no issue doing. And it took months to get basic information about the Sunrise and Thrift Lodge motels. I wrote to the minister about that back in February, after asking for 6 numbers. How much was paid out to the Thrift Lodge this year and each of the last 5 years? We didn't get an answer for months, Mr. Speaker. We asked about this in early February. When did the minister's office actually have this information?
Recognize the Minister of Social Services.
Mr. Speaker, the member got the information. We went over it the other night in estimates, Mr. Speaker, and there was confirmed what I've said from officials that I had no knowledge of this situation, Mr. Speaker. In fact, yesterday, Jeff Redekop, Executive Director of Income Assistance Delivery, Ministry of Social Services, categorically denied the opposition allegations on hotel use. Mr. Speaker, I'm quoting, "Frontline staff are looking for what options are available for clients who are in need. The ministry has generally no knowledge of who owns the hotel and has never been instructed by government to use a certain hotel." He also added about the needs of the clients, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I remind the House the only source of these accusations is the NDP. The only people we're looking to benefit are the most vulnerable people who need a roof over their heads in emergency situations, Mr. Speaker. On this side, we trust our frontline workers, Mr. Speaker. Yes. Why doesn't the NDP?
Here, here.
Recognize the member from Regina Elphinstone Centre.
Didn't touch the question, Mr. Speaker. Again, on what day did the minister's officials forward those numbers to his office with the answers to these basic questions? Did it really take 2 months, or did the minister just not like what that information exposed?
I recognize the Minister of Social Services.
Mr. Speaker, once again, Mr. Redekop, who is the Executive Director of Income Assistance Delivery within the Ministry of Social Services, denied the allegations from the NDP. That's right. I'm going to quote once again. I don't think the member heard it. Frontline staff are looking for options that are available for clients who are in need. The ministry has generally no knowledge of who owns the hotel and has never been instructed by the government to use a certain hotel. He also added, it's about the needs of the clients. And Mr. Speaker, of course, government agrees with that. Mr. Speaker, does the NDP agree with that? What part of that, what I quoted from Mr. Redekop, does that member not understand?
Recognize the member from Regina Elphinstone Centre.
Here again, we see a government that will take credit for anything but is responsible for nothing. Mr. Speaker, getting answers from this tired and out-of-touch government is like pulling teeth. It shouldn't have to be this way. It shouldn't have to take months for basic answers, unless, of course, the Sask Party just didn't like what these numbers showed. Perhaps it's hard to blame them, given the numbers we got on Monday. $1,300 paid out to those 2 hotels before the 2020 election, $750,000 after. How does the minister explain that explosion of payments to the Thrift Lodge and Sunrise motels, Mr. Speaker?
Recognize the Minister of Social Services.
Mr. Speaker, I know the member has handed notes from NDP Central Command and what to read, Mr. Speaker, but I've directly answered these questions, Mr. Speaker. So I'll read once again into the record, Mr. Speaker. Jeff Redekop, Executive Director, Income Assistance Delivery, Ministry of Social Services, categorically denied any of the opposition allegations on hotel use. He said in the media yesterday, Mr. Speaker, I'm quoting, frontline staff are looking for what options are available for clients who are in need. The ministry has generally no knowledge of who owns the hotel and has never been instructed by government to use a certain hotel. He also added, it's about the needs of the client, Mr. Speaker. Does the members opposite not believe in dedicated civil servants?
That's right. Here, here.
Recognize the member from Regina Elphinstone Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll also remind everyone that after the Sunrise motel scandal broke, that minister also said at that time there were no other hotels connected to Sask Party MLAs. That turned out not to be the case. So forgive me while I continue to ask these questions. $1,300 before the election, $750,000 after the member connected to these 2 hotels was elected, to 2 hotels, both of which inflated their rates by 100%, Mr. Speaker. Only for social services clients, only for the most vulnerable. These numbers are even worse than anything we could have imagined. $1,300 to $750,000. Does the social services minister really expect us to believe it's all just a coincidence?
Recognize the Minister of Social Services.
Speaker, if that member doesn't believe me, will she believe independent member of the Value Public Service? Jeff Redekop, Executive Director, Income Assistance. He said yesterday in the media, and I'm quoting again, frontline staff are looking for what options are available for clients who are in need. The ministry has generally no knowledge of who owns the hotel and has never been instructed by government to use a certain hotel. He also added, Mr. Speaker, it's about the needs of the client, Mr. Speaker. We agree, Mr. Speaker, with Mr. Redekop. All the people that work each and every day on the front lines, those in Mobile Crisis Salvation Army who choose what hotels people might need when there's no place in emergency shelters.
Recognize the member from Saskatoon-Wasin.
Answers that this government can offer, I think it is time for change. Last year, our province set a record for overdose deaths. This year, the Sask Party announced cuts to the supports that keep people alive. In Alberta, similar policies have led to a 25% increase in the rate of overdose deaths. Yes, Mr. Speaker, treatment is important, but you can't check into a treatment centre if you have died from an overdose. When will we see an evidence-based plan from this government to make sure that 2024 won't be another record-setting year for overdose deaths in Saskatchewan?
Hear, hear. Hear, hear. Recognize the Minister of Mental Health and Addictions. Hear, hear.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And if the member opposite wants to compare strategies to other provinces, I would encourage him to look just a little bit further to British Columbia and see how their strategy there is working, Mr. Speaker. In this province, Mr. Speaker, we are focused on treatment and recovery because we know that we can save lives, heal families, and strengthen communities, Mr. Speaker, if we can help individuals find treatment and walk a path to recovery. And that's why we are more than doubling the number of treatment spaces available in our communities across Saskatchewan. We are making it easier for people to access those treatment spaces, and we are wrapping supports around them through recovery-oriented systems of care, Mr. Speaker, that address on a holistic basis the individual needs of each person battling an addiction so that we can ensure that they can walk the healthy path to recovery. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Just like to remind the Minister of Social Services, since you brought this up, and opposition, you've done this in the past, but just take this into account. I wish to remind members that you have the privilege of free speech. You should be cautious of the comments directed at those who cannot respond to any allegations made by a member on this floor. Your reference was to members of the civil servant, so just keep that in mind.